Now that the draft is over, the Broncos have gone out and signed a handful of UDFAs, undrafted free agents. So we're going to go through all the UDFAs they have signed because this is a franchise that takes a lot of pride in their UDFA signings. A lot of them have made the 53-man roster. We've seen a handful of guys the last few years. A season ago, Alex Palchevsky, Jaquan McMillan, another example of something like that. So we're going to run through all the UDFAs the Broncos have signed, and I'll tell you which ones I think have a really good chance of making the roster. But reminder, go ahead and subscribe to the channel for free daily videos throughout the entire offseason. Now that the draft is over, a lot of other content creators are going to sit back and just wait till training camp to get underway again, but we're not going to do that here. So if you are looking for a go-to Broncos YouTube channel all offseason long, hit that sub button down below. Now, one of the two premier UDFA signings the Broncos had was Memphis running back Blake Watson. They gave him a pretty hefty guaranteed signing bonus, $250,000 guaranteed and $25,000 signing bonus. So clearly there's a lot of interest from the Broncos in the Memphis running back. He is 24 years old. He played 5 seasons at Old Dominion before transferring to Memphis for a 6th and final season where he would put up 1,100 yards and 14 touchdowns. You can see the Broncos running back room is pretty contested, but speaking of UDFAs that made the 53-man roster, here's a prime example of one. Jaleel McLaughlin last year out of Youngstown State. So we've seen it happen before. I think it's an uphill battle, but after they drafted Audric Estime, that's already one more less running back spot open, but pulling for Watson, I think he's got a decent shot if he continues to have a good training camp and whatnot. Next UDFA signing was Lincoln Victor, wide receiver from Washington State. So 5'7", 178 pounds, not the biggest guy in the world. You can see that Tom Downey, our NFL draft expert, did not have a ranking for him. He started off at Hawaii, transferred to Washington State. He was an honorable All Pac-12 player, 860 yards, 5 touchdowns. The wide receiver room, I think, is more open in this year than previous years. Like, you've got roster locks in Cortland Sutton, Marvin Mims, Josh Reynolds, Tim Patrick, and Troy Franklin in my eyes. Those are 5 wide receivers. Denver only took 4, if I remember correctly, on their 53-man roster a season ago. But I definitely think there is a spot for a UDFA wide receiver to break through the ice. Now, we're going to look at the other UDFA signings in just a brief moment. But first, I do have to shout out our sponsor today, which is Game Time. If you want to go catch a playoff Avs game, a Nuggets game, a Rockies game, or any other sporting event in your local area, download the Game Time app today and use code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. It's the best place to find tickets at the last moment. So get the lowest price guaranteed thanks to Game Time and use our code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but I put all that information in the comments and description of today's video. So shout out to Game Time for supporting us here at the Broncos Breakdown. Moving on to the next UDFA signing, it is tight end from Georgia Tech, Dylan Leonard. Here's what I got on Dylan Leonard, 3-year starter. He was one of 20 semifinalists for the 2023 Jason Witten Collegiate Man of the Year Award, which recognizes college football's best leaders who exhibit exceptional courage, integrity, and sportsmanship both on and off the field. So a very high-character person. Now, he's not a really good receiving tight end, or at least didn't have a lot of production, at least 14 grabs for 156 yards, but we know Georgia Tech is not airing it out offensively. Now, speaking of UDFAs that made the 53-man roster, here's another example, Nate Atkins. So I think the tight end room is far from set in stone, and there are 2 UDFAs tight ends that we'll look at in just a second here. And Leonard definitely has a chance to, nab a roster spot like Atkins did a year ago. Which brings us to our second UDFA tight end from Utah. It is Thomas Yassmin. So 6'4", 245 pounds. Here's what I got on Thomas coming out of Utah and following a teammate of his. First off, he's from Sydney, Australia. So that right there alone is pretty cool. And that should create some fun media clips when mini camp and training camp get around here. Played a handful of seasons for the Utah Utes. Last year, he was injured, missed the last 8 games, unfortunately. Season before that, though, 301 yards and 6 touchdowns. So 13 grabs, half of them were touchdowns. I think you can see how Denver is willing to throw a bone at a guy that could be a nice red zone target. Now, will a UDFA make the 53-man roster? I don't think there's any franchise like the Broncos that does such a great job of scouting out UDFAs, bringing the best ones in. And we've seen so many of them, like Philip Lindsay, go on to have really good NFL careers when the odds were stacked against them. So, yes or no, will a UDFA make the 53-man roster? The next one is maybe my favorite one. I mock draft him to the Broncos a bunch. It's Wyoming's offensive tackle, Frank Crum. So our NFL draft expert, Tom Downey, had him ranked as the 18th best tackle in the draft, overall ranking of 227. I was surprised to see him go undrafted. I think it probably worked out best for him that he did go undrafted because, like Blake Watson, he got a pretty hefty signing bonus and guaranteed contract. So I think there's a lot of interest from Denver to see this guy make the 53-man roster, or at the very least, the practice squad. And that's because the Broncos did not draft a tackle. And that one surprised me just a little bit. Garrett Bowles is entering a contract year. You don't have a clear, swing tackle. You signed Matt Peart, former third-round pick by the New York Giants. Alex Palchevsky was a UDFA who made the roster last year, but he spent much of the season on injured reserve, so we hardly saw him. But Frank Crum got incredible flow and a lot of starts at both left and right tackle, primarily right tackle, but he did spend all 13 games last year on the left side of the offensive line. It was a first-team All-Mountain West Conference player. UDFA number 6, it is defensive tackle Brandon Matterson from UTSA, University of Texas, San Antonio. Tom Downey did not have him ranked, nor did he give him an overall ranking. Third-team All-AAC player last year, 6-year guy in college football, 5 career sacks. Defensive line for Denver has a opening, I would say. They traded for John Franklin Myers, but that's primarily to rush the passer. I think after DJ Jones, it is up for grabs when it comes to who can earn a roster spot. So if you're a UDFA defensive tackle, the Broncos are a good place to be for a good opportunity to earn a roster spot. Speaking of defensive tackles, they signed another one as well, Jordan Miller out of SMU. The notes I've got on Jordan Miller, or a DB out of SMU, I should say, actually, excuse me. 6'3", defensive tackle, 307 pounds. He went to the Shrine Bowl. He played 5 seasons at Miami before transferring to Southern Methodist. 26 tackles, 4 tackles for loss, and half a sack last year for the Ponies. So the DT's got some really good size to him. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're a defensive tackle, being on the Broncos is a pretty good shot of making the roster. Now we move on to linebacker Alec Mock from Air Force. So that's pretty cool, just down the road. 6'2", 238 pounds. Started all 4 seasons at Air Force, so loads of experience, not like a raw talent kind of UDFA. 93 tackles, 2 sacks, 1 interception, and 2 forced fumbles. Linebacker is an interesting room for the Broncos. What are their plans with Drew Sanders? Is it inside? Is it outside? And if it's outside, then I could see an inside linebacker role opening up. So same goes for the next guy we're going to look at here, Levelle Bailey out of Fresno State. I've got 5-year player, 4-year starter for the Bulldogs. Mountain West honorable mention 3 times. It was a second-team All-Mountain West player last season. 82 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, 3 interceptions, and 2 forced fumbles for Bailey. Next player up is Jaylon Allen, edge rusher from Memphis. I have a little personal gut feeling that he could be someone that pushes for a 53-man roster spot. Second team All-AAC last year. He was a 3-year starter for the Tigers, spent 6 seasons at Memphis, 40 tackles, 7 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, 1 forced fumble, 2 pass breakups. They drafted Jonah Ellis at this position. They traded for a similar-ish position in John Franklin Myers. So there's a little bit of competition that just came in, but keep an eye on the Memphis Tiger, Jaylon Allen. And then the final UDFA signing, which probably should have mentioned at the beginning of the video, this stuff can be relatively fluid, so a name may pop up in the future and a guy may lose his spot. It's UDFAs. Omar Brown, safety out of Nebraska. Pretty solid size, 6 foot, 205 pounds. The notes I've got on the Nebraska Cornhusker, as I pull them up right now on the fly, here we go. Yeah, started off at Northern Iowa. Now it's all coming back to me. Then he transfers to Nebraska. At Northern Iowa, though, he was an honorable mention twice. He was an honorable mention last year in the Big Ten. 23 years old, explosive or smoother than explosive is what I have written down here. Eyes of the cornerback to quickly read and crowd receivers is what NFL draft expert Dane Brugler said. Now, the safety room is, I don't want to say crowded, but it's got a lot of young talent. So it's kind of up for grabs after like Brandon Jones and P.J. Locke. Delaire and Turner Yell is kind of hanging on by a thread due to his special teams abilities. Devon Key, if Caden Stearns can stay healthy, he's got a spot on this roster. J.L. Skinner was a 5th-round pick from Boise State last year. Hardly saw him in 2023, so he definitely comes into camp needing to earn his roster spot. So Omar Brown is not in too much of an uphill battle. But to recap, we'll run through all their UDFAs one more time, and you guys can see on screen the 11 players the Broncos brought in. Blake Watson and Frank Crum are probably the 2 names to remember the most if you want to sound smart in front of your friends as guys who can make the roster. UDFAs is kind of a weird thing because you think they have absolutely no chance, and they have close to it, but a lot of times guys prefer to be UDFAs over 7th-round draft picks because then you have a say in where you go, and sometimes UDFA contracts can be bigger than actual 7th-round pick contracts. Like that's the case for Crum and Watson. So I think Denver has big aspirations for those 2 guys to find a spot on their roster or at least practice squad. But that will do it for us on our video today and pretty much wrap up our draft coverage. We started things off on Thursday, going live on the channel for day 1 of the NFL draft. We got you pick-by-pick analysis for every selection Denver made, grades, and then now UDFAs. But don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. You get to see this pretty face throughout the entire summer. So hit the sub button down below for more Broncos offseason coverage.